Good afternoon. I'll be presenting in Arabic myself, and if you want to use the device, please feel free to do so. أرحب بكم جميعا إلى هذه الجلسة ضمن منتدى الدوحة والتي تنعقد بشراكة مع جامعة قطر. هذه الجلسة تحت عنوان الجغرافيا السياسية للمصادر الطبيعية في منطقة الشرق الأوسط، ولدينا جملة من القضايا التي نود أن نتحدث عنها في هذه الجلسة، ويسرنا أن يكون معنا مجموعة من المتحدثين الذين سيغنون هذه الجلسة بآرائهم وأفكارهم. لا شك بأن موضوع الطاقة يحتل مساحة كبيرة في التغيرات التي تشهدها المنطقة، ولذلك كثيرا ما تطغى الأحاديث في الجوانب السياسية على الحديث عن مصادر الطاقة ومدى تفاعل القضايا السياسية معها وتأثير القضايا السياسية على هذه المصادر. هذه الجلسة ستبدأ لدينا حوالي 4 قضايا أساسية سنحاول أن نطرحها مع المتحدثين. سنطرح كل قضية وسنطلب من كل متحدث أن يعلق على هذه القضية. بعد الانتهاء من هذه المحاور ال4 بشكل سريع سنعود إليكم لاستقبال أسئلتكم، ونأخذ مجموعة من الأسئلة ثم سنعود إلى المتحدثين. أولاً أود الترحيب بجميع الضيوف الكرام، والمتحدثين لدينا اليوم هم ميخائيل كروختكن، وهو خبير في الطاقة يأتي إلينا الحقيقة من روسيا. وأرحب أيضاً بكريستيان ألرسون، وهو خبير وأكاديمي معروف يأتينا من الولايات المتحدة، وهو خبير في منطقة الشرق الأوسط. وأيضاً أرحب بسايمون هندرسون، وهو أيضاً من المتخصصين في موضوع الطاقة وفي منطقة الخليج بشكل أساسي. وأود أن أبدأ الحقيقة مع سايمون، ولدي المحور الأول، وهو أنت تعرف بأنه هناك عقوبات جديدة فرضت على إيران في شهر نوفمبر تتعلق بوقف تصدير النفط الإيراني. كيف ترى تأثير مثل هذا القرار على قضايا الطاقة واستقرار أسعار النفط، سواء كان ذلك متعلق في الخليج أو عالمياً؟
You're going to have to repeat that in English, okay. Just the question you asked me.
Yeah, my question is...
My ears don't work perfectly on a good day, and on a bad day with bad earphones they work even less.
No worries. My question was about how do you see the the impact of the sanction imposed on Iran on the global energy sector, and what is the impact of this sanctions, especially Iran will be out of the market?
Well, out of the market is a big phrase,
yeah.
And it's a sort of tabloid phrase for the situation we're in, and I don't think it's going to be the reality. We are having to absorb what that reality is, but the great scheme of things, Iran's exports will have declined from slightly over 2 million barrels a day to, in President Trump's dreams, 0 exports, but the reality is probably about 1 million barrels a day. And so the net deficit, which has to be made up by other people pumping more, is just over 1 million. And when it's not possible to when the overall energy oil demand is approximately 100 million barrels a day, this is just merely 1%. So in strict energy and economic terms, it doesn't mean much. In political terms, it's an interesting dynamic to watch, and will persist for a few weeks, and it will impact on price one way or another. But to the extent that the question suggests, it's going to, or implies that there will be a significant impact on the world energy balance, the answer is no.
Christian, how do you see, as Simon was saying, we should not expect Iran to be out of the market. But you know also that the administration, Trump administration has decided to have a so-called exceptional list of 8 countries. How do you see this influencing the energy sector?
Well, thank you, and I would agree with Simon that the impact is going to be less than the administration would hope. If you look back at the sanctions from 2010 that were successful in changing Iran's calculation and moving towards a position where they wanted to try and engage in diplomacy because of the economic pain, those were undertaken together with UN and EU sanctions as well. They were much more all-encompassing. So the fact that these are unilateral, the JCPOA remains in force, and the fact that the sanctions have not, or there have been waivers, means that their impact will be much less. And the administration hasn't got anything like the international support that it had in 2010 for a much tougher sanctions regime. It can threaten, it can bully, it can hope that international companies will feel that the risks of doing business with Iran outweigh the risks of being frozen out of the US markets. But that can only go so far.
Mikhail, how do you see the role of Russia on this? You know, Russia, there was a lot of speculation that Russia and Saudi Arabia in particular, they will try to fill the gap of the Iranian oil in the market and try to say that, you know, we will stabilize the price. How do you see Russia's role on this and when it comes to the oil, Iranian oil in the market?
Thank you for the question, but basically, when we look at Russia, we do not see any mechanism that the government of Russia, the Minister of Energy of Russia, can regulate oil production, consumption, and exports. Oil companies do that, and they have their own plans. And basically, when we look at the OPEC Plus agreement with the participation of Russia, we see that Russia has, well, only on words and declarations obeyed the general agreement with OPEC. When it said it was decreasing production, Russia was actually increasing that. When we look at the figures, at the statistics of Russian oil exports, we see that nothing happened vis-a-vis OPEC, actually. And Russia keeps increasing production while the prices are convenient for Russia. That's the role of the country now. For 2 years, the year 2017 and the beginning of the year 2018, when the market was not regulated, but dominated by the financial market of oil, by the paper oil, so to say, any declarations by ministers and heads of big companies affected the so-called algorithms or robots which reacted to newspaper specific keywords, and then the prices started going up and down. People started selling or buying in great quantities. But a couple of months ago, something happened. It was at the beginning of October, and about 22 very big players on the paper market just left the market. They preferred to sell their assets. big investment banks, investment funds. We have the list, we have the names of those organizations, and now basically we see that the market is dominated not by those paper oil players, but by the regular supply and demand balance again. Maybe the situation will be repeated of the years 2015 and 16, when the price was fluctuating but still in some sort of a corridor approaching the $45 per barrel mark, and it was good because, but in the year 17, OPEC came to the big game of declarations. And now I think OPEC might be out of the picture again. It is losing ground, and the big players are losing ground. And I think we are in for a new period of maybe stability on this market.
Okay. Simon, can I go back to you? And there was also expectation that it's hard to judge the impact of the sanctions by late 2018. Maybe the impact will appear maybe by spring or the early 2019 actually. How do you see this kind of conclusion that it is not true that there will be no impact on the oil market by having Iran exporting this oil?
Yeah, well, there are two impacts that we're interested in and we're wanting to watch. One is the impact on the oil market, and the oil market is, short of there being another major geopolitical issue, the oil market can cope with the situation of Iran. The other impact is the impact itself on the economy of Iran, and therefore perhaps on the political structure of Iran. And this is at the other end of the scale. So at one end of the scale, you've got the impact on the energy market, which is very sensitive to day by day ups and downs and pieces of good news and bad news, depending on one's definition of good and bad. And the other end of the spectrum, we've got the much slower impact on the economy of Iran, and perhaps, or perhaps not, on the political structure of Iran. And so these are the basic things that we're looking at. And it's there are many factors which go into this, and they are infuriating factors for people who don't understand oil markets. But it's the nature of oil markets that that's the way they are. Oil happens to be an easily transportable liquid which you can take from one end of the world to the other, either on a ship or by a pipeline. And the result is that there's a world market for it, and therefore an international price to it. Hence, things which go well or go wrong in one part of the world have an impact on the price. So I'm just giving you the sort of basic outline in which to try to understand what might happen in 2019. The short answer, and it might infuriate you, but I'm sorry if it does, is that we won't necessarily see any particular change in 2019 on Iran. The reason for this, which people will remember when it happens well into 2019, but I'll give you advance warning of it now, is that these sanctions by themselves are not intended to, from an American point of view, to do the trick. with Iran and cause a change of mind. It's just part of a range of activities and range of pressures which are being exerted on Tehran. And so we may see results or we may not see results.
Christine, I want to move the discussion also to another, I would say, crisis the region is witnessing, which is the Gulf crisis and the blockade in Qatar. You know, as we look at the sanction on Iran as as a major issue when it comes to geopolitics and its impact on oil and gas, oil in particular, the question also is raised about the impact of Gulf crisis, especially the withdrawal of Qatar from OPEC, and how now after 18 months. After 18 months of the crisis, how can we assess the situation now and the impact of this crisis on the oil and the gas marketplace?
I think that the decision to withdraw from OPEC is an illustration of the way this crisis is now having real-world...
Can you bring the microphone closer, please?
Real-world impact and real-world implications. I mean, the OPEC decision wasn't taken overnight. It was taken as a result of careful consideration and study. But it was taken because the Qatar crisis, or the crisis with Qatar, has allowed a degree of space to open up for Qatar to make decisions based on Qatari interests, not on the interests of a wider bloc, be that the GCC, a Saudi-led consensus, or even the wider OPEC bloc. Now, that wasn't... And that predated the crisis. We saw from the announcement in April 2017 that the moratorium of the North Field was going to be lifted and that Qatar would be significantly expanding its production of natural gas. So this was already in the works, but the crisis has accelerated, I think, longer-term plans and made them into reality. And given the political space for the Qatar leadership to take those decisions, it, I think, has implications for other smaller members, either of the GCC or of OPEC, to also think about taking decisions in their own national interest, rather than belonging too closely to a regional structure that is now seen as too Saudi-concentric and which minimizes their own influence within that regional political game. So the impact of the Gulf crisis on oil and gas is creating this new set of arrangements which is really superseding the multilateral, in some ways, the multilateral sets of arrangements we've seen for decades, for 40 or 50 years. And it's having consequences as a result of the attempt of this power play to force a small but energy-rich nation to submit to a consensus from outside, and that could easily transfer to other country case studies as well.
Mikhail, as you see now, Qatar is becoming like Russia. Both countries are a major producer of gas, and also Russia and Qatar is a producer also of oil, and both of them actually out of OPEC. Do you see any possibility that the countries may work together when it comes to the oil in the future? How do you see, for example, Russia perception of the Qatari decision when it comes to the withdrawal of OPEC, particularly?
Yes, it's a paradoxical situation. Russia is, virtually joining the OPEC organization, and Qatar is leaving it. And, Russia cannot be a full member of the organization because, basically all the members of the organization are national oil companies which can, listen to what the governments of those countries say. The Russian oil companies do not obey the government. They do what they want. They have their own programs. And so Russia cannot be a full member of OPEC. And historically, when Russia was promising to OPEC that it was going to cut production, it happened in the year 2000, the first attempt of such a coordination. During the whole year, Russia declared that it was cutting down production. At the end of the year, it turned out that it increased production by the same volume that it promised to cut down. So it's not cooperation, it's cooperation in declarations, basically. As to the decision of Qatar to leave OPEC, I think we should also regard that as part of a broader picture. As the CEO of Qatari Petroleum said at one of the previous sessions, one of the reasons was the understanding that the Americans are going to adopt NOPEC, a sort of legislation that would punish the members of OPEC as a cartel and punish them, maybe to prohibit import of oil from members of OPEC. Qatar did it quite in time. First, it has financial interests in the United States, a lot of interesting projects, and then now it can export oil to the United States, even if they adopt that new legislation. And if the legislation is adopted, and I believe that the chances are very high next year that it will be in place, then maybe we will see that OPEC would disappear from the arena altogether. Every member of OPEC, well, let me demonstrate a hypothetical picture. Will try to sell as much oil as possible, including Saudi Arabia. And some of the members of OPEC who cannot increase production will get Iranian oil and smuggle it and sell it as their own. And so I do not think that there will be a shortage of oil supply on the global market.
Simon, on the same issue, I mean, how do you evaluate, the decision of withdrawing of OPEC, taking into consideration that there is an argument that if there was no Gulf crisis, Qatar would not withdraw of OPEC. Do you think this sounds or makes sense?
It makes partial sense, but I think it's a much stronger argument that Qatar was not an obvious member of OPEC any longer. Of course, Qatar was one of the first members of OPEC, but in those days, Qatar was an oil producer, and that was all. And since then, as we well know, Qatar has become a very significant producer of natural gas, and the revenues it gets from exports are mainly from the exports of LNG, liquefied natural gas, rather than from oil. And so in economic terms, it makes very good sense not to be affected, not to need to be in OPEC, which notionally puts a restriction on the amount of oil that Qatar can sell or Qatar can produce. It was even before the Gulf Rift erupted last year. This economic way of looking at Qatar's membership of OPEC was already relevant, and it's only become increasingly so, given that Qatar has had to be in a position to negotiate on energy as part of the OPEC cartel, while on every other subject it wasn't speaking to some of the other members of OPEC.
Christian, can we move to the Mediterranean? In the last few years, there was very interesting developments when it comes to the oil and gas. And we look at what Israel is doing, the Lebanese government, and Turkish activities. Can you tell us what's happening? Why all of this, is happening now in the last 2-3 years, and how to understand it in a political context?
Well, the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean is in some ways a tinderbox. partly because you have several different states with different political and geopolitical orientations competing over a undersea shared resource without necessarily agreeing on the boundaries of that shared resource. And when you bring issues like the Israel-Palestinian and Lebanese domestic politics into the mix, it could be quite combustible. There is, of course, an interest in Qatar in the sense that Qatar Petroleum signed in April 2017. In fact, I think it was the same day or perhaps a day after the lifting of the moratorium of the North Field. The Qatar Petroleum announced an exploration and production agreement with ExxonMobil for a block, an offshore block, southwest of the coast of Cyprus. And so Qatar and Qatar Petroleum now have a strong interest in clearly a demarcation, delineation of the boundaries, but also in the peaceful and consensual decision to look at those resources and to see if they're commercially viable. Whether it's wise to get sucked into a geopolitical vortex is another matter, but given the scale of the resources in the Eastern Mediterranean, the likelihood is that they're going to be developed at some point. And Qatar, for reasons, for commercial reasons, is now partnering with ExxonMobil and is going to be part of that process.
Mikhail, again, focusing on the same point, if you read what's published about these developments in some of the media outlets in Russia, especially in English, I'm speaking about English, there's a certain level of concern about it from political perspective. They are worried of seeing this kind of activity pushing towards a political instability. How much this, how much this kind of argument can be sold actually to the people in the region, saying, this is what we believe.
Do you mean the Eastern Mediterranean?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a very big problem, really. And for Russia, which is interested in the South European market of gas, it is a vital problem because, some people in Moscow suspect that it will be competition for gas of Gazprom there. I do not think this is true, because when the producers of gas in Eastern Mediterranean are studying the market, they show that even Southern Europe is not a very good market. It would be much more convenient to have some LNG there and to export it where the real market is. Demand is not growing in Europe. It will be flat. When local production is decreasing, yes, this gap will be replaced maybe by Russia, maybe by some LNG, but LNG is plentiful right now. And Russia has a lot of cheap gas to offer. And so to bring some new gas, to invest in some gas producing projects with the target of hitting the European gas market, I don't think this is sensible. I'm watching what Turkey is going to do. They wanted to become a hub, a gas hub, and the Europeans kept saying, no, we do not want a gas hub outside the borders of the European Union. And I do not think this is a very good idea for Turkey, which has now too much gas. It has already two pipelines from Russia. Now the third one is going to be completed very soon. It has a new pipeline in addition to the old one from the Caspian area. It has a pipeline from Iran. Turkey is increasing its capacity of importing LNG. In addition to two terminals, it is building number 3 and expanding the capacity of those two. And Turkey is planning to import more gas from Iraqi Kurdistan and talking to Israel of importing gas from Israel. They do not have that demand in Turkey. And when I spoke to Turkish officials, I visited Turkey twice this year to speak about their plans on the gas market. I suggested a fantastic idea. Maybe instead of that, very weak demand in Europe, you should consider some agreement with Turkmenistan to build a short pipeline across the Caspian Sea and sell your gas to China. So I do not think Turkey is a very good place to produce more gas and to sell more gas. They are not a good partner. This is why the Israelis, when they were considering gas pipelines to Europe across Turkey, they dropped that idea. Then they are propagating the idea of building a pipeline directly maybe to Cyprus or avoiding Cyprus to Greece. But their main plan would be to build a short pipeline to Egypt, because Egypt has some spare capacity for liquefaction of gas. And maybe they would liquefy gas and sell it on the global market, but not to Europe. So Eastern Mediterranean is good, has good prospects for producing gas, regardless of political considerations. But the problem is the market. The solution is LNG.
Yeah. Simon, how do you see these activities actually impact on increasing the level of tension in the region, in the Mediterranean region, I mean, this kind of activity about oil and gas? How do you see the impact on increasing the level of political differences or between the players in the region?
Yes, the Eastern Mediterranean used to be a peaceful part of the world. It's not a peaceful part of the world at the moment. And so there is a potential for some disruption. The only good sign, really, is that in energy terms, and you can tell that I'm a sort of energy economist, most of the world's energy is in the Gulf region here, and comparatively very little is in the Eastern Mediterranean. So the overall impact on world energy supply and demand is not that great. But if I could describe this to you using my finger drawing a line, and I'll do it backwards from my point of view so that it will seem the right way around from your point of view, which is if you are imagine the southeast corner or southwest corner of Turkey, and you go, Turkey runs sort of east-west, or in this case west, from the west to the east, and then goes round the corner to run north-south. And there's the Syrian coastline, and then the Lebanese coastline, the Israeli coastline, a little bit of Gaza, and then you turn another corner and you come back on the going from west to east along the Sinai, the Egyptian Sinai, and then the other side of the Suez Canal. Now, in the gas is, and it's mainly gas in this part of the world, is offshore. And so the question arises of where do you draw the border lines on this? And there's something called the International Law of the Sea, and the rule on that is that essentially you have 200 miles off your own coast, which you can claim if there are natural resources there. But if you are less than 400 miles, so to speak, from your neighbor on the opposite side of the sea, then you divide it, the difference between you. Now, the problem in the Eastern Mediterranean is that this would work quite well if it was just a question of Turkey having its slice of sea, and the same for Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Gaza to an extent, and then Egypt. But the problem in the Eastern Mediterranean, or not that it sees itself as a problem, is Cyprus. which is stuck there in the middle of the water. And Cyprus has a complicated political relationship with Turkey, which, for reasons of ethnic divide, Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots, but it gets worse than that in terms of demarcation of offshore areas, because Turkey argues that the islands aren't entitled to 200 miles from according to the Convention on the Law of the Sea. And so from a Turkish point of view, much of what Cyprus is now looking for, or in the areas which Cyprus is now looking for gas in, actually belong to Turkey. And there's been deployment of Turkish warships and Turkish aircraft when there's been some drilling going on. And Kristin made a remark about a current field being, or current block being drilled by a consortium of 80% ExxonMobil and 20% Qatar Petroleum. That means that Qatar Petroleum is only providing money, and Exxon Mobil is the operator and is doing the work. And this is in something called Block 10 off Cyprus. It's from Turkish point of view, Block 10 doesn't belong to Cyprus. They actually think Block 10 belongs to Egypt. Egypt, to confuse matters more, has an agreement with Cyprus where there's no argument between Cyprus and Egypt on the sovereignty of Block 10. All this is, for the moment, theoretical, but as I said, they're now drilling, and the waters in this part of the world are about 6,000 feet deep, i.e. they're much, much deeper than they are around Qatar, where we're probably talking 100, 200 feet for most of the cases anyway. And when you're drilling a hole to discover, try to discover hydrocarbons, whether it's gas or a bit of oil or whatever, it's going to take you 3 months because the reserves were, if it's 6,000 feet to the seabed, it's probably at least another 6,000 to 10,000 feet before you're going to get to hydrocarbons. So it's going to take you 3 months before you get to any reserves or not. It's only at that point that you know whether your drilling has been successful. In the meantime, it's cost you $100 million. So this is a high stakes environment. If you find oil or gas, the 100 million is money well spent. If you don't find anything at all, it's a complete loss, which makes looking for it a very expensive business. This is why, logically, countries in the Eastern Mediterranean should work together to not to have arguments about where their jurisdictions lie or their access to minerals lie. But the reality, as we well know, of Eastern Mediterranean is, apart from Turkey and Cyprus being one dispute, there's a war going on in Syria, or a civil war going on in Syria. Lebanon has an uncertain status, and Israel and Gaza have their own issues as well. So this, the Mediterranean is an interesting area from an energy point of view, but also a potentially problematic one as well. The only merit in this, in energy terms, is that even if you find it, Europe probably doesn't need it because Europe is oversupplied, so you have to take it elsewhere. And so you have to convert it probably into LNG. There are a couple of underutilized plants in Egypt, and then perhaps take it through the Suez Canal to the market in Asia, which seems to have an almost insatiable thirst for LNG. That's the picture of the Eastern Mediterranean.
If I want to move on to Asia a little bit, because it's well related to the situation in the Gulf and in the Middle East as a whole. As we know, Asia using a lot of oil because of population, because of China itself, it's needed more oil in the next 20 years, more than maybe few countries in Asia itself. So, what is the impact, or what is the geostrategic implications of all of this on the oil market or energy market in general, Chris?
Well, in some ways, the Gulf crisis is a microcosm of the changing energy landscape, in the sense that we may look back in the future and think of 2017 as a turning point, where had there not been a Gulf crisis, some of the additional LNG produced by Qatar could have gone to local markets in Saudi Arabia or the UAE, which do need gas quite urgently. And instead, they are now going to be locked into long-term agreements. In Asia, we just saw a 22-year deal signed with China, for example, taking us to 2040. Over the longer term, the incredible demand for gas in Asia will continue to provide nations like Qatar, which are gas producers, and oil producers to an extent, a means of offsetting the flatlining in demand from industrialized economies as they try to become more fuel efficient and as clean technologies begin to become more prevalent, especially in a climate-stressed world. So for the Gulf states, at least, the future is in Asia economically. The energy partnerships are with Asia, of course they're also with European states as well. And the key question from a geostrategic point of view is whether that will ever be complemented by political and security relationships as well. Because until now, we've seen very strongly the political and security relationships maintaining with the West, with the United States, and with several European states as well, those long-standing partnerships. So you may have a situation where they look west for their political and security relationships, east for energy and economic relationships. Would there one day be a tension between the two, or would the political and security relationships over the longer term just follow the trade? And I suspect that if you continue to have a rhetoric like in the Trump administration of America first, you may have questions later on about why the US, for example, should be underwriting maritime security for countries in Asia that benefit from the protection it provides. On the other hand, and as Simon talked about, the interdependency of oil markets, even if there's a shift in US geopolitics towards the Pacific, and Obama spoke of the pivot to Asia, that in no way lessens the importance of the Gulf, because Asian economies are much more heavily reliant on this part of the world for their energy requirements than the US is. And so if the US sees Asia as its long-term partner economically, that increases the importance of having a stable and secure energy partnership for those Asian countries with the Gulf.
Mikhail, what do you think about this?
Well, I think the oil and gas producers in the Persian Gulf should watch very closely what is going on in the Pacific area, because the market is there, and the most interesting market is there. Just a small example. I spoke last year when I was in Beijing, I spoke to the Chinese about their strategy of importing gas. Piped gas or LNG, and they told me, you see, we have a national strategy. We prefer not to buy gas. We prefer to produce gas in other countries and to bring our own gas to China, regardless of the Henry Hub prices or anything, any commercial. It is already our gas. We are bringing it home. And it took Russia about 15 years to persuade the Chinese to accept some gas, some piped gas from Siberia into China. I asked the Chinese, what is the meaning of your agreement with Gazprom to import that gas from Russia? And they told me, you know, that's an emergency case. If the situation in the Pacific is too bad for LNG carriers to reach China from other parts of the world, then we'll go and buy Russian gas by pipe. So the situation is both geopolitical and commercial, and it's a very strange mix of the factors. And I think it would be wise to watch those factors very closely.
Simon, do you have any view on this issue?
In world energy terms, Asia is where the great market for oil and gas is, simply because there are some big economies there, and many of the countries don't have much of their own indigenous oil and gas. Japan is the most glaring example of this, which is essentially 100% dependent on energy imports. The dimension that I'm intrigued by going forward is the balance between demand for oil and a shifting preference for natural gas. There are a couple of trends here which I find fascinating. There is much greater concern these days about the environment. Simply put, if populations walking around cities have to wear face masks, they probably also don't want, they certainly don't want coal-fired power stations, and probably don't want any sort, they want much less hydrocarbons anyway. So there's a domestic political push for a change. Qatar here is at an advantage in that its great strength is natural gas, and natural gas is the obvious preference for power production compared with coal. But it's the interesting dimension here is that Australia is now producing substantial amounts of natural gas. And I hate to tell you this if you didn't know, but if you thought that Qatar was the largest supplier of natural gas, the answer is it was, but it isn't at the moment because Australia has just taken over that ranking. Now, Qatar is working on plans to expand its natural gas production, and asked me again in 5 or 6 years' time, and the league table might have shifted back in Qatar's preference again. But I just want to illustrate that things are moving in that direction. This will also have a consequence for price. In that if there's more LNG out there, unless demand grows astronomically, the price of LNG may trend downwards. And LNG is expensive to produce. But the price, at least in the past and currently, is sufficient that countries like Qatar make a healthy profit out of it. Australia's own LNG industry is not so well placed in terms of profitability. And the overall impact might be that Qatar has to face a less profitable LNG future.
Thank you. Now I'm turning to our guests. We will have around 15 minutes for questions. So we'll take a few questions. You make your questions short so we can come back to our speakers. Yes, please. Here. Microphone, please. Can we make the questions short so we can take good number of the question, please?
Thank you very much. My question will be addressed to Mikhail. I think you have information about Qatar Dolphin pipeline. Now on, we are under blockade. The government decided to continue their producing the gas to UAE, and you know UAE is part of the country who's blockade on Qatar. And due to the contract, which I go through it, it is clearly mentioned that we can cancel this contract, but they decided to have a continue of producing oil and gas to whole region without linking it to policy or decision of foreign policy. Do you think that this is a correct decision? Because I asked it to a number of senior officials and they say, yeah, it's a correct decision. But to me as a person, I think it is not a correct decision because we are paying extra due to the blockade. Why we don't let them pay this extra due to what they are creating to us? And maybe because of this shortage of payment, which is $1 as a privilege to a GCC countries, they are like blockading us and using this advantage to create a problem to us. Thank you very much.
Can we make the answer also short because the question?
Well, thank you for the question. You see, you are asking a Russian expert to give opinion on the political issues of relations between Qatar and neighboring countries and the Emirates.
Expert.
You see, I can only say that I am against all cases when economy is a weapon of promoting some political targets. It should be vice versa.
Thank you.
I would be delighted to answer a political question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
But my understanding of some of the details of the example you gave was that Qatar is supplying by pipeline gas to Dubai, and currently, if it didn't, the lights would go out in Dubai, and the air conditioning would stop as well. So you have this investment you've made, you're supplying the gas, you get paid for the gas. That's the economic reason you keep going with it. The political reason is, I have to tell you, utterly obvious, that Dubai is very grateful that the lights are still on, and therefore represents an internal split in the front of the UAE in its argument against Qatar. So keep it going.
Here, please, here. To Abdul, please, here. Okay. If we make the question short, we can take more than a question, please.
Good incentive. Thank you very much, Abdullah Shaji from Kuwait Political Science Department, Kuwait University. There is a new dynamics, it seems. The United States now is the #1 oil producer in the world. It overtook Saudi Arabia, and it overtook Russia because of the shale oil and gas revolution. Australia is now the #1 LNG producer. The question is regarding the Gulf energy security, the output, do you see in the future some kind of internationalization of Gulf security? With the United States less dependent or more sufficient, less dependent on the energy from our part of the world here, with China is becoming the #1 oil importer, what kind of dynamics do you see? Number two, how do you explain regarding the Qatar pulling out from OPEC, the meeting of OPEC just a few days before that, after that, on the 6th of December, and their decision to cut off oil by, I don't know how much, by 1 million barrels, which is equivalent to the Iranian loss of 1 million barrels from Iran. How come oil prices did not inch up? What are the scenario for 2019? Do you expect to have the same oil prices around hovering between $60, $70? And what's the impact of Trump input over all of this? We are losing on a daily basis now because we are listening to Trump. Is that correct assessment, or is it an exaggeration? Thank you.
Can you keep your answer? I'll take those two questions quickly, very short. If you please make the question very short, please. So I'll come back, because I need to take, and then we come back to you, if you don't mind.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Eng Seng Ho, Middle East Institute, Singapore. Very simple question. On the expansion and diversification of the consumption base for gas, things like floating storage and regasification units are much cheaper, easier to deploy. Is it attractive for gas producers like Qatar, Australia, to support the use of such technology to expand the base of consumers from the solid ones like Japanese utilities to much poorer countries across the world, and will this create shorter-term contracts and a spot market?
Last question here, please. Gentlemen here. Here. Do the mic, please. No, here, please. I'll come back if there's time. Sorry. I'll take just this side, please. Again, make the question short so we can take another two questions, please.
Quick question.
Quick questions, yes.
There's been talk of building a gas hub in Southeast Asia, Singapore, or something like that. Would that be useful for Gulf states like Qatar, and what can you do to help support that?
The gentleman behind there, please. Yes, sir. There. Again, shorter question, please.
Yeah, sure. Ismail Al-Amadi from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Qatar. Regarding this Australian big gas production, as stated, will have on Qatar gas production. Unfortunately, gas oil contract is 25 years old contract, so I don't think so it would have any effect on Qatar production in short. That's number one. Number two, quick question. Regarding the effect on Iranian economy, this been going on for years, sanction, and Iran is continuing for exploration, development, things. I doubt if it has really significant effect on Iranian economics, the sanction. Thank you.
Last question there, gentleman there, and then I'll come back to you guys.
Hello, sorry, it's not a question, it's just a slight reply to my brother in the front row. One point that Qatar continues to supply Dubai is because energy reputations are built over decades. So if Qatar stops supplying UAE, that's a reputational issue that in face of a crisis, Qatar is stopping. This is an added value to our reputation that in face of extreme adversity, we still continue to supply, no matter what.
Okay,
that was my point.
Thank you. Simon, please, if you have any quick feedback, please, on the questions. We'll have to make it short as well.
I'm horrified by the wisdom and knowledge of the audience, which is outstanding, clearly outstanding. Inevitably, I'll take a stab at some of the answers to that. The greatest impact on what the price of oil will be next year, if I were to choose one of probably many different factors, is the state of the Chinese economy. You tell me where the Chinese economy was going to be, and I'll talk to you about the price of oil. And the current suggestion is that it's slowing down, and will this, and the obvious implication of that will be that its demand for oil will decline. On energy security, the Gulf is in an extraordinarily vulnerable position. To prosper, you have to export energy, whether it's oil or natural gas, and you have to, that requires you to have infrastructure on land and at sea and then in ships, all of which are vulnerable to attack, military attack. I have been both to Al Udeid Air Base here and Ras Laffan, your LNG mega facility up in the north. Ras Laffan is totally vulnerable, and the last thing you want is an attack on Ras Laffan, and indeed the Saudis and Bahrainis, the Emirates, and even the Iranians have equivalent vulnerabilities. And Al Udeid is made up of hardened shelters where aircraft hide from such attack as well. And so they're vulnerable in their own way, but it's a necessary combination that you have energy security. And so if we can, the question then becomes of, do we rely on good sense that people don't go to war? And sadly, the experience is we can't rely on good sense, so you require deterrence. Deterrence usually means the only reliable deterrent out there is the United States. I'm trying to separate that answer away from a man called President Trump. I live in Washington, D.C. My wife and I have a very simple rule to maintain our sanity, which is we don't talk about President Trump until the 6:30 news in the evening, and it is not yet 6:30.
My apology of my colleagues, speakers, and you, and the organizer is indicating that we have to end the session. Please join me in thanking Michael Krottingen, Christian Alderson, and Simon Henderson. Thank you all for your questions. See you on the next session.